morning. My name is Shelley Guy. I'm a Vice President in the Global Business Development Group here at DBRS Morningstar. On behalf of DBRS Morningstar, I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today for this webinar. ESG has been an important focus for our analytical team here at DBRS Morningstar. Last year, we released our ESG criteria, which is our approach to environmental, social, and governance risk factors in credit ratings. This criteria is applied across all the sectors we cover. Today, we will focus on the ESG factors that impact Canadian railways. We will discuss the key analytical considerations for companies in the railway industry, and we will walk through each factor and understand the exposure, triggers, and the impact as it relates to credit risk. We will also review how these ESG risk factors are incorporated with our methodology, as well as how they impact an issuer over time. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my team, Raja Kalra and Amaury Baudin.
Good morning. My name is Raja Kalra. I work as an Assistant Vice President at DBRS Morningstar within the Diversified Industries Group. I cover companies within transportation, manufacturing, and business services sectors.
Hi everyone, my name is Amaury Baudin. I'm a Vice President at DBRS Morningstar in the European Corporate Credits Group in London. I cover a variety of credits in the industrial and services space over here in Europe. And I used to cover the Canadian railway companies in Toronto, and that's why I'm here today.
So we've identified 11 ESG risk factors as they pertain to Canadian railways. And 5 out of those 11 relate to environment. And we'll see that there is a little bit of overlap between those 5 factors. So moving on to the next slide, the first environmental factor is emission, effluents, and waste. And the Canadian railways have a meaningful exposure to this environmental factor, mainly because they transport millions of tons of hazardous materials on an annual basis. These include fertilizers, petrol, chemicals, and coal. Derailment and accidents involving such hazardous materials have happened in the past and are a risk. When such events happen, they lead to high remediation costs, penalties, and lawsuits. While those are direct impacts, there's also an indirect impact which comes in terms of increased regulations, such as limitation on train speeds. An unfortunate example is what happened in Lac-Mégantic in Quebec in 2013. There was a Montreal Marine and Atlantic Railway operated train which leaked 13,000 liters of diesel fuel and killed almost 47 people. And this is one of the deadliest train accidents in the history of Canada. Ultimately, that company filed for bankruptcy Chapter 11 in the same year due to this. So that is the extent of risk that it poses to the Canadian railways. However, both CN Rail and CP Rail have done a good job managing these risks. The next risk factor is carbon and greenhouse gas emission costs. As you would see in the pie chart to the right, that only 1% of Canada's greenhouse gas emission is attributed to railways. This is as per the Railway Association of Canada data, as compared to 25% that's contributed by the entire transportation sector. So railways are certainly a lot more energy efficient as compared to other modes of transportation. However, we do identify that there is emission, and the main source is the diesel fuel consumed by the locomotives. Both CP Rail and CN Rail have taken a lot of initiatives to reduce their emissions. And a good example is Canadian Pacific Railway Company's recent initiative to launch the hydrogen locomotive program in 2021. Moving on to the next slide, which is the third factor as it pertains to environment, is energy and resource management. Trains in North America, including Canada, primarily run on diesel fuel, as compared to Europe, where there's a mix of diesel and electric run trains. Thus, fuel is a key component of operating expense for both railways. Approximately 10% of revenues are spent in terms of fuel cost for both Canadian National Railway Company and Canadian Pacific Railway Company. Thus, energy cost management is critical for maintaining competitiveness when customers are price sensitive. However, having said that, if you look at the chart to the right, which lays out the fuel gallon consumed per 1,000 gross ton miles, a lower number is better because that means that a railway company is using lesser fuel to move the same amount of freight. And the two lines at the bottom, the blue line is Canadian National Railway, which is definitely a leader in fuel efficiency. And then the red line is Canadian Pacific Railway, which kind of competes for the second spot with CSX Corp. Now moving on to our fourth factor on the next slide is land impact and biodiversity. Both Canadian railways run thousands of miles of rail tracks that go through forests, prairies, wetlands, and national parks, both in the US and Canada. Thus, they get meaningful attention from environmental activists. There is a danger to the land surrounding the railway track, plus the ecosystem that these trains run through. For example, there was a forest fire in Minnesota that happened in May 2016. The US Attorney Office determined that this was caused due to mechanical failure in a CN Rail operated train. And thus CN Rail had to pay $1.25 million in damages in 2020. Now, moving on to our last environmental factor, which is also our fifth environmental factor, climate and weather risks. Due to the coast-to-coast operation of the Canadian railways, they are exposed to extreme weather conditions, including the harsh winters, as well as the blazes and wildfires. A recent example is the June 2021 wildfire that destroyed the village of Lytton in British Columbia. This led to more regulations being imposed by Transport Canada on the railway companies. First, the railways are now responsible for removing combustible materials from the track. And second, there is speed restrictions on hot days in areas with extreme risk of fire. And every time a new regulation is implemented, it adds to the cost of operation. Now, in terms of harsh winters, train lengths need to be reduced when temperature dips below a certain level. And there are months when such temperature dips below these levels. And that is when both Canadian railways use more amount of locomotives and personnels to move the same amount of freight as the train lengths are reduced. So that covers the 5 environmental factors, the sources of risk, and what needs to be managed by the Canadian railways.
So let's move on now to the social factor. That's the S in the ESG. So social factors in ESG are really comprised of 3 sub-factors. So first of all, the human capital and human rights factor. So on the next slide, we'll see what it entails. So for obvious reasons, Canadian railways and other railways, have very highly skilled workers, trained conductors and other engineers. And in order to keep that technical expertise in place, they need to attract and retain talent. And that is very important. And they need to be able to offer good wages, good careers, and a good kind of quality of work in order to do that. And obviously, a failure to do so would have a negative impact on the revenue and the bottom line of the railways. They can also be exposed to claims, lawsuits, and disputes over working conditions and wages. And as you probably know, a lot of the railway companies, workers and employees are part of unions. There's a few of them. For example, the last big example Most recent example that we have is the 8-day conductor strike at CN Rail that was in November 2019. And the labor strike was just due to negotiations that didn't go well about wages and working conditions. So 8-day doesn't seem like a long time, but it actually had a very negative impact on CN Rail's fluidity in terms of its network, its revenue, and its bottom line. And if you look at the operating ratio on the right hand of this slide on the chart, you'll see that Q4 2019 is on the higher end of things. And as a reminder, an operating ratio is simply the operating expense divided by the total revenues expressed in a percentage point. So it obviously had a pretty bad impact for that particular quarter. So it's one of the examples as to why Canadian railways and railways in general really have to manage human capital and human rights in a proper fashion. Moving on to the next slide, occupational health and safety. It kind of overlaps the factor that we just talked about now, but it's slightly different. As you probably know, railways transport every year hazardous material, and the workers of those railways are exposed to noise and vibrations and other things that can affect their quality of life and their health, and that can lead to chronic diseases and other things, other negative impacts on the health of the workers. And again, this could lead to potential labor strikes, which we already talked about, and the potential damaging effect it can have. So it's extremely important. And it's important to note as well that the railways do report about the incident rate and the accident rate. And both Canadian railways are really good in doing so. And they keep the incident rate really low by being very diligent in managing those risks. So in that regards, both railways are leaders in the industry. Obviously, failure to manage this properly could have a negative impact, which is kind of by the same token as the previous factor. Moving on to the next slide, and last but not least, in the social side of things, in the ESG, is community relations. As you can imagine, railways and Canadian railways in particular operate on a very wide geographic area. In Canada, they go from coast to coast, and they even have tracks in the US. So, they do have to keep a really good relationship with all the communities that the tracks go through, and that includes indigenous communities. So they do have to, talk to these communities, making sure that everything is going well. And obviously, this can be a sensitive topic as the tracks go through, indigenous communities' land. One of the most recent examples that we have in mind is the blockade or protest that happened on a CN Rail operated line between Toronto and Montreal. That was for most of the months of February in 2020, just before COVID hit. And even though the protest and the blockade wasn't due to anything that CN Rail did, really, it was just because of a pipeline project in the western part of the country. But that particular blockade between Toronto and Montreal, which is a very important corridor, that had a very negative impact on CN Rail's operations. And again, if you look at things like revenue or operating ratio and the overall fluidity of the network in that particular quarter, you will notice that it had a very adverse effect. So again, just to summarize, community relations is extremely important and hasn't been more important than today. And the railways have been doing so far a good job in keeping those relations in good standard. So with this, I'll hand it back to Raja for the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Amory. So now moving on to the governance risk factors. We identified 3 risk factors that's common across all corporate issuers. So as we move to the next slide, the first governance factor is bribery, corruption, and political risks. Because of the jurisdiction in which the Canadian railways operate, there is low risk in terms of bribery and corruption. However, Canadian railways are exposed to regulatory regime imposed by Government of Canada, and that can be with respect to rates, which can lead to financial impact, And there is also the risk of governance over train speed, etc., impacting operational efficiency. And train speeds, as we mentioned in our earlier part of the presentation, are most likely implemented, based on safety concerns. And as far as rates, etc., are concerned, it's more with respect to more essential goods and commodities. Moving on to the next slide, business ethics. This pertains to violation of taxation and accounting rules, anti-competitive practices. Canadian Railways have done a good job staying away from these, and so we haven't identified anything of that nature. And the last slide with respect to the governance factors is corporate and transaction governance. So if a railway company does not adhere to mandatory corporate governance, such as we look at board composition, senior management, auditors, company ownership, stock structure, etc., and there could be negative rating implications for any company where we find deficiencies, but we haven't seen anything of this nature with the Canadian Railways. However, we should mention that because CN Rail and CP Rail are publicly traded companies, there is high scrutiny on their governance practices, and thus it is important for them to maintain high standards of governance, which they do. Thank you very much. That's the end of our presentation.
Thank you, Raja and Amari. I'd now like to open it up for any Q&A the audience might have. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A chat button. So the first question that we have is, are ESG factors already factored into the railway methodology? And if so, how?
Thanks, Shelley. That's a good question, and I'll try to answer that. So yes, they are factored into our methodology, and there are 5 business risk assessment factors as it pertains to the railway methodology, and one of them is energy cost management, where we look at the railway companies and determine how well they manage their fuel costs. So that directly ties to the environmental factor that we've discussed. We also look at operating efficiency, how efficient the railway companies are, and fuel cost is a component of that, and also how well they manage their community relations and relation with the employees, so that there's no blockades or strikes or things of that nature. So to summarize it, yes, these factors are implicitly built into our methodology.
Thank you, Raja. The next question, how do CN and CP stack against other North American railways in terms of energy cost management?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll take this one if that's okay. So I think CN and CP Rail, they've been leaders in terms of energy cost management for some time. And if you go back to the slide where we have a chart talking about that, you'll notice that they're really ahead of the pack when comparing them to the US peers south of the border. And they're the leaders in energy cost management. As you know, energy cost is one of the largest cost items that the railways have. They obviously have other costs, but energy is a major one. And this is due to some kind of historical reasons behind that explain that. One of them is that they operate on a wider geographical area than the US peers. They have to deal with harsher terrain and harsher climate, especially in the winter. And so for that reason, they've been very disciplined for many, many years. And the result of that is also that their operating ratios most of the time is amongst the best as well in the industry. So they really stack up pretty well, to summarize. And in terms of ESG, obviously they rank pretty well because the energy cost being mostly diesel fuel has been kept relatively efficient. And in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, they've been also leaders in that regard. So just to summarize and answer that question, they are amongst the best in the industry when compared to the US peers.
Thank you, Murray. The next question. So the presentation covered many risks across ESG, and is there any one risk or perhaps top 3 risks that you see as being the most significant for railways?
Maybe I'll start with one that I think is quite important, and then maybe Raja will have some more to talk about. I mean, I think personally, occupational health and safety is one of the most important risks out there for the railways today. I think the most recent reminder is the labor strike that CNRail had to deal with. That was in November 2019, so not that long ago. Obviously, CP Rail also had to deal with that in a different fashion and for different kind of duration. But strikes are pretty common occurrences, and they're just a response to working conditions, wages, and the unions trying to improve that day after day. So I think it's quite important. They are big employers in Canada, in the US as well. So I think for the railways, it's really something that they need to keep top of mind, because a strike, even if it's a few days, it has massive repercussions, because it's a network. So if you have a disruption on one part or partially on the network, the rest of the network will be affected, and it has pretty strong consequences. So I think for me, that would be the one risk that's quite important. But maybe Raja has some more to talk about.
Sure, thanks, Amory. Yeah, so on the environmental side, maybe there's 2 things I'd like to talk about. And one is the emission effluents and waste, and other is climate risk. So with the first one, because the Canadian railways carry millions of tons of hazardous materials every year, and the example that we discussed with Loch Megantic, that was something of a huge scale. Nothing of that sort has happened recently, because Canadian railways have done a really good job in managing these risks, even though there have been one-off incidents. But just by the nature of the products they carry, that is an ongoing risk which needs to be managed well. And then the second one is the climate risk, because the railways do operate through the wildfires and also through extreme winters. And so they do have to manage that on an ongoing basis to stay efficient, to avoid fines, lawsuits, etc. So those are the 2 that I would say.
Thank you so much, Raja and Murray. If there are no further questions at this point, that does conclude our presentation for today. Thank you once again for joining us. We hope you found it helpful. This presentation will be available online in a few days. And if you have any further questions for our analytical team, their contact information is displayed. Please feel free to reach out to them. Thank you again. Goodbye for now.